To fly like a bird, to enter a new element and look down on the earth like a god. It has been the dream of man since he first looked upward. That dream was made real at the turn of the century. Two brothers from Ohio became the first of a brotherhood of inventors and pioneers who broke the shackles of gravity and reached for the skies. All of this has taken place within a man's lifetime, since the adventure began here on the sands of Kitty Hawk in North Carolina in 1903.
How did man learn to fly? It's carved in granite on top of that big hill. It reads like this: in commemoration of the conquest of the air by the brothers Wilbur and Orville Wright, conceived by genius, achieved by dauntless resolution and unconquerable faith, because man will never fly. 1.5 million years of scratching into the sky stop at that rock. Man flew.
Orville and Wilbur Wright were bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio, builders, practical men. But they were fired by the curiosity and the passion to fly. First, they studied the mechanics of bird flight. Then they experimented with kites and gliders. And finally, they brought their theories here to Kitty Hawk. "12 seconds and 90 yards of flight that changed the history of the 20th century. At first, the Wrights were simply not believed. However, little by little, they refined their machine. And 2 years later, the Wrights were flying 25 miles at a stretch. They were still the only people in the world who possessed a practical, powered aircraft. Until that time, Europe had been the leader in the race towards the sky. But efforts there, in France especially, had concentrated on airships like that of the Brazilian Albert Santos Dumont, who caused a storm of excitement by flying his airship over Paris. But Europeans were still a long way from their first real aeroplane. It wasn't until 1906, a year after the Wrights had flown 25 miles, that Santos Dumont took Europe's first 60-yard hop in his extraordinary 14 bis. Among those watching was Louis Blériot, the Frenchman, who 3 years later was to catch the imagination of the world. On a blustery morning in July 1909, he pointed his plane towards the seaway which divides Britain from France, the English Channel, chasing a 1,000-pound prize. It was a dangerous gamble. But 36.5 minutes later, he landed his plane in England to the delight of his compatriots. In just over half an hour, he'd become aviation's first star. His flight had been a catalyst for a new explosion of interest in man's newest adventure. People went out to buy planes. They thronged to air meets. A new figure, the pilot hero, had been born. It wasn't long before the shape of aircraft began to conform to a standard. Engine at the front, wings in the middle, tail behind. Typical of the planes of the period is the British AERO triplane, built by AERO in 1909. It's a masterpiece of design, elegant and practical. In the triplane, the controls have been refined into a system whose principles are with us still, though it retains the Wright brothers' old technique of wing warping. It was aeroplanes like this that introduced man to the sheer exhilaration of flight. After the triplane came the legendary AERO 504. It was tougher and more solid than the triplane, with only 2 wings and more effective controls. It was a winner. Nearly 9,000 of these planes were built between 1913 and 1931, when it finally went out of service. It was a 2-seater and turned out to be an ideal training airplane. And it had a revolutionary engine that cooled itself by rotating along with the propeller.
Let us start.
Ready to start.
Set. Contact.
Contact.
With the arrival of the 504, aviation became a science. The plane, unlike earlier aircraft, was entirely predictable. It would do what it was asked to do. New flyers drawn to the skies could learn from it the principles of flight. World War I pilot William Lewis remembers.
The AERO was an absolutely superior super aircraft. It flew well, but was highly sensitive. Mistakes showed up so clearly, but they didn't run you into a spin or a crash or anything like that. They could be rectified. So it was a good training aircraft.
Streamlined training became even more important during the First World War. Pilots were now in huge demand. 26,000 were trained by the British Royal Flying Corps alone. So at the war's end, there was an enormous surplus of trained pilots and cheap planes. One result was show business. At the same time, along came the new airmail service, which brought together into one vast correspondence huge tracts of land like the United States. And now was the age of the trailblazers, who set out to find long-distance routes across the world. Alan Cobham flew the length of Africa.
We had flown up from the blistering heat of the Sudan to Uganda. I was called Bwana Mkubwa Ya Indege, the great master of the bird.
Then in 1927 came the most famous trailblazer of them all.
A bashful 25-year-old flyer climbed into a monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis. From a New York airport, he took off into the darkness on the first solo flight across the Atlantic.
33 and a half hours later, Charles Lindbergh landed in France to become overnight the most famous man on Earth. He had succeeded in shrinking the gap between Europe and America.
Then he returned to America, and in New York received the most stupendous welcome of them all. Lucky Lindy, they called him then.